Her name was Yukiko. She was barely 16 years old when the gates of Edo Castle closed behind her forever. It was March 15, 1704, and she had just become one of the 3,000 women imprisoned in the Oku, the secret harem of Japan's most powerful shogun. For the next 10 years, Yukiko would experience horrors that defy human comprehension. Her story, reconstructed from palace documents and testimonies of the era, reveals the brutal reality of a system designed to break the human soul. Yukiko managed to survive a full decade in this hell. But the price she paid for that survival changed her forever. This is her story. This is the story of how a vibrant young woman became a living ghost, and of the 8 specific moments that defined her descent into the abyss. Prepare to live 10 years of horror through the eyes of a woman who lost everything, including herself. Before we dive into Yukiko's story, I want you to know that what you're about to hear is not fiction. These are documented facts that have been hidden for centuries. If you value these real stories that reveal the truth about our past, please subscribe. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these stories that the world needs to know. Subtle text. Subscribe for more real hidden stories. Now join me on March 15, 1704. Yukiko is about to experience her first horror. Yukiko trembled as she walked through the Oku corridors for the first time. Her sweaty hands clutched the edge of her new kimono, the white one that symbolized her purity. She didn't know that this would be the last day she would remember her own name with clarity. They brought her before the chief Otoshiori, a stone-faced woman of approximately 50 years who had survived 30 years in that place and had become the highest female authority in the palace. Her eyes were empty, as if she had forgotten how to feel. Yukiko didn't know she was looking at her own future. This veteran supervisor, whose real name had been erased decades earlier and was now known only by her title, explained the rules to Yukiko with a voice as cold as steel. She told her that her previous life had ended, that she must now swear eternal silence about everything she would see, hear, or suffer in that place. The chief Otoshiori warned her that speaking of that place, her family, or even her real name meant death, not just for her, but for everyone she loved. Palace documents record that this threat was not empty. Entire families had been executed for their daughters' indiscretions in the Oku. Yukiko felt as if her tongue had been ripped out. In that moment, something inside her died. It wasn't just the fear of death that paralyzed her. It was the understanding that she had just become complicit in her own destruction. That night, alone in her new cell, Yukiko whispered her name for the last time. But even whispering it felt like betrayal. She had begun the process of erasing herself. During the following weeks, she witnessed the execution of a young woman, a kitchen servant barely 19 years old, for mentioning her sister's name during a nightmare. Yukiko understood that even her dreams no longer belonged to her. 3 months after her arrival, Yukiko experienced her second breakdown. It was a rainy June night, and the sound of drops against the windows reminded her of her home in Kai province. She approached the window, desperate to see the outside world. But the windows were designed for cruelty. Placed too high by the castle's architects, they only allowed her to see a small piece of gray sky. Yukiko stood on her tiptoes, stretched her arms, jumped, but she couldn't see anything more than clouds. That's when reality hit her like a punch to the stomach. She would never see a tree again, never feel rain on her skin again, never walk through an open field again. She was 16 years old, and her life was over. Years later, Yukiko would remember that moment as the definitive breaking point. She collapsed on the floor and cried until she had no tears left. But even crying was dangerous. The other women looked at her with terror, knowing that her pain could be contagious. In the Oku, even sadness was a crime. That night, Yukiko made a decision that would haunt her forever. She decided to stop feeling. It was the only way to survive. She began building walls around her heart, not knowing that each wall took her further from her own humanity. At dawn, when the other women woke up, Yukiko was no longer the same. Her eyes had lost that spark of life that had characterized her. She had learned the first lesson of the Oku. To survive, you must first die inside. After a year and a half in the Oku, Yukiko had risen slightly in the hierarchy. She was no longer the terrified newcomer. Now she had authority over the younger servants, a group of teenagers who performed the most basic tasks in the palace. And that September day, the system forced her to use that authority in the cruelest possible way. A 14-year-old girl named Hana, a tea servant recently arrived from an impoverished farming family, had spilled tea during an important ceremony. It was an accident, the kind of mistake any nervous teenager could make. But in the Oku, there were no accidents. The senior Oto Shiori, an even more veteran woman than the one who had received Yukiko, a 40-year survivor in the palace who had lost all capacity for compassion, ordered Yukiko to punish the girl, 20 lashes. She warned that if she showed compassion, she would receive 40 herself. Yukiko looked at Hana, who was trembling like a leaf. She saw in her eyes the same terror she had felt upon arriving. For a moment, her humanity fought against her survival instinct. But survival won. Each lash that Yukiko ordered was like a nail in the coffin of her soul. Hana screamed, begged, but Yukiko kept her face impassive. She had learned that showing emotion was weakness, and weakness meant death. That night, Yukiko vomited until only bile came out. Not because of the horror of what she had witnessed, but because of the horror of what she had discovered about herself. She was capable of torturing an innocent child to save her own skin. Hana, the young tea servant, died 3 days later from infection in her wounds. Yukiko never spoke her name again, but she could never forget her screams either. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. 8 months after the incident with Hana, Yukiko received the notification that all women in the Oku, both feared and expected, she had been chosen by Shogun Tsunayoshi, the 5th Tokugawa shogun, a 63-year-old man known for his cruelty and eccentricity. Yukiko was 18 years old and about to experience her 4th horror. The preparation began 3 days before. Yukiko was subjected to medical examinations that humiliated her more deeply than any physical punishment. The palace doctors, elderly men who had lost all human sensitivity after decades of examining women like livestock, inspected every inch of her body. The chief physician, a 70-year-old man named Hayashi, who had served 3 previous shoguns, declared that Yukiko was perfect for the shogun's purposes. No marks, no diseases. He ordered them to proceed with purification. For 3 days, Yukiko was bathed, perfumed, and prepared like a sacrifice by the palace attendants, women who had gone through the same experience and now perpetuated the cycle without showing any emotion. She couldn't eat meat, couldn't drink sake, couldn't even choose her own clothes. Her body no longer belonged to her. The night of the encounter, as she walked toward the shogun's chambers escorted by silent guards, Yukiko felt as if she were walking toward her own execution. Because in a way, she was. Years later, in the few testimonies she managed to give before her death, Yukiko would remember that she tried to send her mind somewhere else, as she had learned to do during punishments. But this time she couldn't escape. She was trapped in her own body while it was used as an object. What followed was not intimacy. It was ritualized rape. Yukiko was reduced to a vessel for the pleasure of a man who didn't even see her as human. And worst of all, she was surrounded by official observers, palace scribes who took notes of every detail for the historical records. When it was over, Yukiko was escorted back to her chambers, as if nothing had happened. She was expected to be grateful for the honor received. But Yukiko knew that something fundamental had been destroyed inside her that night. She bathed for hours, trying to wash away the feeling of filth that seemed to have penetrated to her bones. But some stains never come out. Yukiko's 5th horror was not something that happened to her, but something she was forced to witness. It was February 1706, and a woman named Hanako, a 24-year-old concubine who had been in the Oku for 6 years and was known for her gentleness, had committed the unforgivable crime of sighing during an encounter with the shogun. Yukiko knew Hanako. She was one of the few women who still retained something of humanity in that place. A survivor who had managed to maintain a sad but real smile despite years of suffering. The punishment was designed to be a lesson for everyone. Yukiko and the other 3,000 women were forced by the palace guards to form a circle around the central courtyard. No one could close their eyes. No one could leave. The guards had orders to execute anyone who looked away. The chief executioner, a nameless man who had served the shogunate for decades and had lost all capacity to feel compassion, announced that Hanako had shown ingratitude toward the shogun's honor. Her punishment would serve as a reminder to all. For 3 days, Yukiko had to watch them torture Hanako. They stripped her naked, whipped her until her back became raw flesh, left her chained under the winter cold, and throughout that time, Yukiko could do nothing but watch. What tormented her most were not Hanako's screams, but the moments of silence. When Hanako no longer had strength to scream, she only moaned softly, like a wounded animal, and Yukiko realized she herself had made similar sounds. On the second night, as Yukiko would remember years later, Hanako looked directly into her eyes. There was no accusation in her gaze, only understanding. She knew Yukiko couldn't help her, just as she hadn't been able to help others before. In that moment, Yukiko understood that they were all victims and executioners at the same time. Hanako, the gentle woman who had once comforted newcomers, died on the 5th day. Her body was left in the courtyard for 2 more days as a reminder. Yukiko had to walk past it every day, watching the woman who had once been kind decompose. That experience taught Yukiko that in the Oku, compassion was a deadly luxury. She decided to bury any vestige of empathy she had left. She didn't know that by doing so, she was burying the last part of herself worth saving. In 1714, when Yukiko had been in the Oku for 10 years, she experienced her 6th horror, the demonstration that even after a decade of absolute obedience, no one was safe from the system's paranoia. It all began when a veteran woman named Ejima, a high-ranking supervisor of 40 years who had served faithfully for 20 years and was responsible for the palace's cultural activities, arrived late to evening curfew after attending a kabuki performance. A delay of minutes triggered an investigation that would destroy over 1,300 lives, including almost Yukiko's. At 3 in the morning, shogunate investigators, officials specialized in extracting confessions through psychological torture, burst into Yukiko's room. After 10 years of perfect obedience, of having sacrificed her humanity for survival, she was dragged away to be interrogated like a criminal. The chief interrogator, a man named Matsudaira, who had destroyed hundreds of lives during his career and prided himself on his ability to break any person, shouted at Yukiko that they knew she had conspired with Ejima. He demanded she confess her crimes or her family in Kai province would be executed. Yukiko, terrified after a decade of conditioning, begged that she hadn't done anything, that she had served faithfully for 10 years, that please they shouldn't hurt her family. For hours, Yukiko was psychologically tortured by a team of specialized interrogators. They deprived her of sleep, forced her to maintain painful positions, threatened her with tortures that would make her previous experiences seem like children's games. But what broke her most were not the threats against her, but the threats against her family. After 10 years without seeing them, her mother and father were still the only real thing she had left in the world. At some point during the 3rd day of interrogation, according to palace records, something broke in Yukiko's mind. She began confessing to crimes she had never committed. Just to make them stop, she would have said anything, betrayed anyone, just so they wouldn't hurt her family. Yukiko witnessed how innocent women were dragged from their rooms, how entire families were destroyed by imaginary associations. She saw how Ejima's brother, an honest merchant who had never set foot in the Oku, was beheaded like a common criminal. When they finally released her, for lack of evidence, Yukiko was no longer the same. Paranoia had become her constant companion. She no longer trusted anyone, not even herself. She had learned that in the shogun's world, innocence was no protection against anything. In 1709, 5 years after the Ijima scandal, Yukiko experienced what she thought would be a blessing. She became pregnant by Shogun Ieyasu, the 6th Tokugawa shogun. She was 21 years old, and for the first time in years, she felt something like hope. She didn't know she was about to experience her 7th horror. From the moment the palace doctors confirmed her pregnancy, Yukiko lost any vestige of autonomy she had left. She was moved to the breeding chambers, a special section of the palace, where pregnant women were treated like human incubators. The chief palace physician, the same elderly Hayashi, who had examined her years before, explained that she carried in her womb a possible heir to the shogun. He warned that her body no longer belonged to her, that any action that could harm the baby would be punished with the slowest death they could imagine. For 9 months, Yukiko was treated like a human incubator by a team of specialized caretakers, women who had gone through the same experience and now supervised others with professional coldness. She couldn't choose her food, her sleeping position, or even when to use the bathroom. Female guards watched her 24 hours a day, reporting every movement, every expression to the palace supervisors. But despite the horror of her situation, Yukiko began to love the baby growing inside her. At night, when no one was watching, she would put her hands on her belly and whisper promises of love. It was the only real thing she had felt in years. On April 15, 1709, after a brutal birth without anesthesia, assisted by the palace midwives, expert but compassionless women, Yukiko gave birth to a boy. For 3 glorious minutes, she held her baby against her chest and felt a joy she had forgotten existed. As she would remember years later in her scarce testimonies, the baby was perfect. He had her eyes and the smallest fingers she had ever seen. For a moment she thought that maybe all the suffering had been worth it, just to meet this little human being who was hers. But those 3 minutes were all they allowed her. The palace attendants, following protocols established for decades, tore the baby from her arms before she could even count his little fingers. They told her he was no longer her son, that he belonged to the shogun and the Tokugawa clan. Yukiko never held her son again. She could see him occasionally from a distance during palace ceremonies, but was forbidden to approach, speak to him, or show any sign of maternal recognition. To him, she was just another woman in the palace. When the child turned 8, he was moved to the male quarters of the palace to begin his education as a member of the Tokugawa clan. Yukiko lost even the possibility of seeing him. Her son became a ghost, a presence she knew existed but could never touch or know. That night, Yukiko cried for the first time in years, but even her tears had to be silent. Yukiko's 8th and final horror was not something done to her, but something she chose. It was May 1714, 10 years after her arrival at the Oku. She was 26 years old, but felt as if she were 100. When Shogun Aitsugu, a child of barely 7 years, died, and there were changes in the palace under his mother's regency. Some lower-ranking women were freed as part of the reforms. For the first time in a decade, Yukiko had the opportunity to leave. She could see her family again, breathe free air, live like a normal human being. But when the moment came to decide, Yukiko discovered something terrifying. She no longer wanted to leave. According to palace records, Yukiko stood in front of the open gates of the Oku for hours, seeing the outside world for the first time in 10 years. She should have run toward freedom, but all she felt was panic. She wondered how she could live without being told what to do every minute, how she could sleep without the sound of guards patrolling, how she could exist without the structure that had kept her alive. Yukiko realized that the Oku had achieved something worse than killing her. It had made her choose death herself. Freedom had become more terrifying than slavery. But there was something else. For 10 years, Yukiko had done terrible things to survive. She had tortured other women, betrayed companions, lost all her humanity. She wondered how she could live in the real world, knowing what she had become. In her final testimonies before her death, Yukiko would confess that she realized she was no longer Yukiko. That 16-year-old girl had died long ago. What remained was just a shell, a ghost that had learned to function but not to live. She didn't deserve freedom. She wouldn't know what to do with it. Yukiko chose to stay. Not out of loyalty, not out of honor, but because freedom had become impossible for someone so completely broken. She became one of the veteran women, perpetuating the same cycle of abuse that had destroyed her. She spent her final years in the Oku as a shadow, teaching new arrivals the survival rules she had learned with such pain. But she never told them the real price of that survival. Yukiko died in 1741, at age 57, never having left the palace after entering at 16. Her death was recorded simply as natural death by the palace scribe. But those who knew her knew the truth. Yukiko had really died on March 15th. What died in 1741 was just the body that had housed a soul destroyed decades earlier. Yukiko's story is not unique. It's the story of thousands of women who suffered in silence within the walls of the Oku for over 250 years. But by telling her specific story, by following her personal journey from hope to despair, we can understand the true human cost of oppression systems. Yukiko was a real person, with dreams, fears, and the capacity to love. The system didn't just kill her physically, but forced her to kill everything that made her human. And in the end, it made her complicit in her own destruction. Her story reminds us that behind every historical statistic is a human face, a beating heart, and a suffering soul. Yukiko's story deserves to be told because it reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists in all societies, including our own. Only by understanding how these systems worked in the past can we recognize and resist when they appear in the present. If Yukiko's story impacted you, if you believe these voices from the past deserve to be heard, please subscribe to support our work of unearthing these hidden stories. Every subscription helps us ensure that women like Yukiko are not forgotten. In the comments, share which moment of Yukiko's story impacted you most. Was it when she lost her name? When she had to hurt Hana? Or when she chose to stay in her prison? Your response helps us understand how these stories affect us today. Yukiko couldn't tell her own story, but we can tell it for her. And by doing so, we honor not only her memory, but that of all the women who suffered in silence. Let's remember Yukiko, not just as a victim, but as a complete human being who deserved a better life. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even when that spirit is finally broken. In memory of Yukiko and the thousands like her. Edo. Period 16003, 1868.